Turning now to Alberta. As we've reported, the province has the highest active case rate in Canada and the United States. 569 active cases per 100,000 people. Heightened restrictions are now in effect. And the CBC's Aaron Collins is on the story and joins us now live from Calgary. So Aaron, tell us about the new restrictions.
Well, what's old is new again. If you're here in Alberta, Albertans kind of woke up to what they were experiencing around late fall through the holiday season and into the early new year. If you got kids in school, they're not in school today. They're at home. They're online learning. If you wanted to go out for dinner or a beer on a patio, that's not happening. Sort of a cascade of changes to the restrictions has happened. Everything from reductions to the amount of people allowed in church services, which occurred over the weekend, all the way through to how many people you're allowed to have to your backyard. That went down from 10 to 5. So really the province recognizing that we are in that tough spot, as you mentioned. We do have the highest per capita case numbers in North America, higher than India, believe it or not, and something needed to be done. So we're back in the situation that we found ourselves in earlier in the year, and it's sort of the third big lockdown that this province has experienced.
Mm-hmm. And Alberta is expanding its vaccine rollout to every Albertan over the age of 12 starting today. Tell us about that.
They are, yeah. I can tell you that uptake has been swift on that. I can tell you that because I signed my 14-year-old up. I was up early online waiting for the system to get going. And when I logged in 30 minutes before the official program was to start running, there was already 30,000 people in front of me. So, but within an hour, my 14-year-old was booked to get the Pfizer vaccine, and he'll be getting that in about a week. So heard from some neighbors and other people in the neighborhood as well. Generally, it's gone quite smooth. Site didn't crash, and there's certainly a lot of interest. About 1.9 million Albertans already receiving doses have already been sent out. Of course, some of those older folks, have received 2 doses, but about 35% of the Alberta population has received some kind of vaccination at this point, and that continues to roll as the numbers are lowered. We saw last week 30 and up was sort of included in the rollout, and there was big uptake there. So Albertans definitely anxious to get the jab.
Albertans also, though, getting arrested, at least some. Tell us a little bit about that over the weekend.
Yeah, so we have seen these pushback from certain, and I think it's important to note it will be a very small portion of the Alberta population, and we've seen similar sort of pushback to restrictions across the country. But there has been a lot of pushback from certain groups here in Alberta. A couple examples: there was a local preacher who'd been defying restrictions on attendance to his services, was arrested. Him and his brother were arrested over the weekend here in Calgary after continually defying this. So they were having church services with packed indoor services, no masks, and really defying health orders in the province. They'd been warned and warned and warned, and finally they were arrested. Similar, there's a cafe in rural Alberta in a place called Mirror, Alberta. A cafe is called the Whistle Stop. They've been sort of defying the indoor dining restrictions that have been in place and continuing to operate. Again, warning after warning after warning. The Premier signaled that these repeat offenders were not going to be tolerated anymore, and we saw evidence of that as the crackdowns kind of rolled through the province. And you saw the impact almost immediately as well with other planned protests. There was a protest planned for Friday at a superstore in downtown Calgary where the anti-lockdown protesters were planning to take over the supermarket. Well, lots of media showed up to watch them show up and have their protest. But once people started being arrested and public health orders were being enforced, nobody showed up. So I think the increased focus on enforcement by the province is helping to sort of contain those limited but important sort of countermeasures to what the province is trying to accomplish.
That's interesting, Aaron, because some of the critics of the government's approach has been there's just been no enforcement, and so you can't, if you have rules without any enforcement. Tell us more, though, Aaron. It sounds like Alberta sounds like a very interesting place to live at this point in the pandemic, with the vaccine rollout speeding up, with splits within the governing provincial party, with some people questioning these public health guidelines. I mean, what's all that like, sort of coming together, swirling all at once?
Sure. I mean, like in Alberta, I think that if you're from Alberta, you would know this. How you feel about the pandemic, how you feel about vaccinations, how you feel about the restrictions that have been put in to limit the spread of the virus depends on a couple things. It depends in large part on where you live. So if you're not living in a place where you see a lot of COVID, I suppose it would be understandable to see a bit of pushback to restrictions because they've been blanket across the province. I know in Ontario, you guys had more targeted and regional restrictions. Here, it's for the most part, when restrictions came in, they came in across the province. So there were small towns and small communities where maybe they had no cases of COVID, but all of a sudden their local restaurant was shut down. They weren't allowed to have gatherings in their backyards. And that's shifted a little. There has been some attempts by the province to address that. There are regional exemptions to some of these things. But for the most part, if you live in Calgary, a hotspot, if you live in Fort McMurray, if you live in some of these larger centers, there is some fairly large buy-in for the most part in most communities to these restrictions. But there is a political element to this as well. And there is a segment of the United Conservative Party, Jason Kenney, the Premier obviously here, his party, who have openly sort of spoken out against restrictions. Interestingly, not this time. I think the Premier's had a talk with his caucus, but previously there was a letter signed, 18 MLAs signed on saying that they didn't agree with the restrictions. The Premier has said he's okay with his MLAs speaking out against policy as long as he's not encouraging the constituents to defy it. So that's the line he's drawn in the sand. We haven't heard that vocal pushback this time. I think the party whip has been out there whipping up the MLAs to keep them in line, recognizing that we're at the worst part of the pandemic here in Alberta, and we really, really need to get the curve bent back down.
Aaron, thank you. That is the CBC's Aaron Collins live in Calgary.